So the first series of stories then is about the shaping influences that that set me in a direction of being qualified and capable and wired even to be a specialized transitional minister. It was one of the questions that I was asked in the interview yesterday. What circumstances um, put you into this? I'm not going to repeat my answer there, but as part of the answer, some of these things came up. And but for me, the ones I do want to say is that for instance, when I went to King's as an undergraduate, I my course load was all in the social sciences. Um, I was actually hoping to avoid becoming a pastor and move into either counseling or social work, but it didn't pan out that way. So one of the main influences that I see now has given me some skills for this work is that as a preacher's kid, we moved a lot. So about every 3.5 years was the custom in those days, and so every 3.5 years, I had to learn my way in a new community. And that experience gave me some skills in terms of reading the lay of the land, is how I put it, um, of understanding, figuring out what's going on. In fact, as I got into boyhood and teenagehood, it became like, where do I fit on the hierarchy in this class? And who's going to challenge me to a fight in order to reestablish their place on the hierarchy higher than myself? Those kinds of dynamics helped to shape me a lot. A lot. Some of it, there was a time when I thought it was a big negative, and it still has an effect on my life. Where when you move a lot as a child, it's pretty hard um, to establish roots, shall I say. So then the next one is that I'm the firstborn in my family, and I think that has shaped some things in who I am. The sense of responsibility that comes with that. If you read Kevin Lehman on birth order, I have him up here somewhere, and but more so the firstborn of a pastor. So a couple of layers to that. That is, in the culture that I grew up in, there was an expectation that the firstborn would follow in the father's footsteps, whether that was dairy farming or plumbing. And so there was that kind of, in fact, even spoken expectation in my case. But the bigger part was only realizing in adulthood the pressures that I had felt as a child to be an example to the community. Mom and dad didn't necessarily push that so much. In fact, they protected us from it to a degree. I remember well the Monday morning after the Sunday night where I wore jeans to church in the 70s, and they were brand new. First time I wore them publicly, but there were some phone calls. So um, so there was that dynamic that I grew up under, but didn't identify and didn't really see until I was an adult examining my life. And that's a unique thing about preachers' kids. Most preachers' kids know this. It, I think, has attenuated somewhat in the current age, but it was there. And then the other layer of that is the that my parents were both immigrants, and at least in the Canadian situation, but also now in refugee populations that some of our churches have within them. That that's quite a factor because you live between two worlds. Your parents, in my case, Dutch cultural background, or the church's Dutch cultural background, and you being more of a Canadian um, in the normal society, and then trying to navigate the difference between those things. Now, it wasn't as extreme as it is for some people because they um, like some people, the original language is still spoken in the home, which makes it a bit more challenging. But we spoke English in the home, but there was still stuff there. So those all, in various levels, had an influence on who I became, and what I was watching for whenever I was in an environment. And most of those have a helpful effect now in STM work. As a person who moved frequently, as an immigrant who would end up in situations your people had not dealt with before, I developed a skill in what I call reading the room and understanding, trying to get a read pretty quickly on what was going on. Was this even a threatening environment? Going to the public pool when I was a young boy, and learning the etiquette and lack of finesse in some of the lineup rules for public pools, and seeing people get picked on, and those kinds of things. Just watching and reading and understanding and making sense of the patterns that I saw, all were developed out of those things that I listed, and more. The other one, and this one I will not elaborate on in the video sense, particularly because, well, quite frankly, some of the people that were on other ends of the hardship or in the hardship with me might end up seeing the video and have experienced it differently, and those kinds of things. And so I'll just list them as categories, like in a Reader's Digest title style. But the important point is that, especially when I was starting my second contract as an STM, I began to see how the hardships I'd been through in times when I was asking God, what is going on here, and what am I supposed to do in the middle of this? And I didn't know, and I didn't see in the time, but somehow made it through reasonably sane. There are those who would argue that. Once I became an STM, these things helped me to do my work courageously. Because I'd been in phases where I'd basically lost almost everything, except some deeper sense of faith. There were plenty of times. There were times when I couldn't sing in church. It was that rattling, but there was still a sense of carrying on for God's sake, even if I don't understand what's going on. It's a beautiful thing to be able to look back and realize that those things gave me insights that help me do my work well. And those hardships are these. First, my father was deposed in his retirement as sexual abuse that he had committed with women in the family and extended family came to light after he retired. And so I share a last name. I had to deal with all of that as the oldest son, and there are many unpleasant stories in there, and so that was a hardship, and yet what it has created for me is, first of all, some insight into what certain kinds of abusers behave like, and how they fool people, and how they don't understand their offenses because they're cerebrally oriented and they're not emotionally in touch. So that's just a quick overview of that one. Then I've been through a marriage failure, and that was, by the way, all of these three that I'm mentioning happened or came to a head within about an 18-month period. And so that was a stressful time. So a marriage failure, that was disorienting and confusing. And then on top of that, that ended with an Article 17 from the congregation that I was in at the time. And there too, I have under my belt the experience, trying to tell it without sounding like a whining victim, but I've had the experience of the church rejecting the wounded, or not knowing how to deal with a pastor who's in distress and wounded and confused, and so then it's not even strategic. So then just preferring to not have that person around. Yeah, that's I better stop there. So those three things in particular have grown me. Some of the counseling that I have taken related to those things, and some of the reflection and reading have grown me in awareness of things that these are awarenesses I would not likely have had without those experiences. So those are the shaping influences that, prior to even really seriously considering becoming a specialized transitional minister, occurred in my life. I will say providentially, although whenever I tell these stories, I say, those three is enough. I think I've learned enough now. We could stop. But they were essential to who I became and preparing me to become a specialized transitional minister. So that's the first set.